Record.
We're good. You can start. All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Ohio McKinney-Vento Community of Practice. Let me give folks some time to get in here. See our attendee numbers going up and down. Welcome, everyone. Thanks so much for being here. And we are going to get started at about 1:03 for the sake of time. We have a lot of content to cover today. I know folks are kind of moving in between meetings, but as a reminder, this session is being recorded. So if you happen to miss anything at the beginning, no biggie. You can come back to the recording at any time. If the team, Evelyn, maybe if you could take a second and put the slides in the chat for anybody who's with us now, you'll have an available copy of the slides to take home with you today. Thank you. And if you all could, who are attendees today, if you could just quickly let me know in the chat that you can hear me okay, that our audio is working, that everything looks okay on your screen, that would be super appreciated. Thank you. If you do happen to have any audio needs, you can message me directly. If we could get closed caption turned on, if we have that ability, I think that would be great. Thank you everyone for letting us know that the audio is working. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and get us started because we need to keep moving. So welcome again to session 2 of the Ohio McKinney-Vento Community of Practice. Today, we'll be focusing on identifying and meeting the unique needs of students experiencing homelessness in the rural parts of our state. With that, we can move on to the next. And just as a reminder, you don't need to know everything that's on this screen. I think most of us are pretty acclimated to Zoom at this point, but your lines should automatically be muted. If you want to communicate with us today, we really encourage you to use the chat to do that, and we will have an opportunity for question and answer and discussion. So as things come up for you all throughout the session today, please feel free to comment or post questions in the chat, and we will review those and receive those as we go through. All of the handouts, the slides for today have been put in the chat. Evelyn will continue to put those in the chat as folks keep coming in the room so that you can see them. They've also already been posted to our website. So just cohio.org/homeless education. You can go right to the website and grab the slides as well. We don't have any polls or quizzes today, so you don't have to worry about that. We're not doing any breakout rooms today. We are going to be covering a lot of exciting content though, so stay with us, and we can go ahead to the next. Awesome. So let's get into our agenda for today. We definitely want to welcome you and get to know who all is in the room today. And then we have a wonderful guest from the National Center for Homeless Education with us today, who's going to give a national overview of rural student homelessness. And then we're going to dive into some data-driven facts of rural student homelessness from Chapin Hall at the University of Chicago. And then we are going to shift to our panel of local folks, including McKinney-Vento liaisons, homelessness service providers, and youth who have lived experience of homelessness and are members of youth action boards around the state are going to share with you all about how things are shaping up around rural student homelessness in their communities. We're going to do some quick reminders around community of practice. This is our second session with this group, so just want to make sure everybody knows where everything is and how to get any of the materials that you need, and then we will close and move on with our day, and we'll prep for our next session after summer. So our objectives for today, what are you going to walk away here with? We're hoping that, as always, you understand the components of COHHIO Course to Home, you understand the national scope of rural homelessness, and hopefully that helps you to see how you're not alone in some of these challenges, and that there are many communities who are working to prevent and end youth and student homelessness in their communities all across the country. You're going to learn some best practices for meeting the needs of students experiencing homelessness in rural Ohio. You're going to get some resources to support students experiencing homelessness. And of course, you are going to get the opportunity, and we hope that you will connect with your peers through the chat and any other way that you find helpful of others that are in community of practice with you today. So with that, we'll go to welcome and introductions. And so first, I would love to know who's with us in the audience today. If you could please share your name and your pronouns, the name of your district, or if you're with an ESC, you can tell us a little bit about your ESC. And then if you could name one small thing that you appreciate about your rural community. And so take a second and do that in the chat. And while you do, I'll keep moving, but I'll elevate some of those as we go. But please take a moment, share your name, your pronouns, your district or your ESC, and one small thing you appreciate about your rural community. With that, I want to make sure everybody knows the COHHIO Course to Home team. I think you do. I'm Lisa Brooks. I'm the Youth Housing Initiative Director. Ami, give us a wave, and Evelyn, give us a wave. These are the folks who are behind the scenes, answering your emails, responding to your questions, providing your technical assistance, planning your communities of practice. We are your support team in order to address student homelessness in your district. And we have lots of guests with us today, so let's go to the next. We have our guest presenters from the National Center for Homeless Education and Chapin Hall with us today. They'll tell us more about themselves and their work in a few moments. If you could go to the next. And then we have our very important local spotlight panel. So these are folks who are working directly in the field to prevent and end homelessness in their communities. We have Amy with us, two Amy's with us today, Amy Eldridge and Amy Vanderhoff, Keith Ring, Randall Hunt, Sandra Plants, and we have Kenny, one of Ohio's soon-to-be graduates, which he'll tell us all about, joining us from the panel today. And you can see on that slide where everyone's from. We'll spend a little more time digging into what area everyone represents. And then as a friendly reminder, COHHIO, who we are, right? COHHIO is a big organization, and COHHIO Course to Home is just one component of all of that work that we do around advocacy and training and technical assistance. And we operate our continuum of care, our landlord-tenant law, all the work that we do around special populations. And so COHHIO Course to Home is nested within the youth initiative at the Coalition on Homelessness and Housing in Ohio, as you all probably know, but just as a quick reminder, we can go to the next. Let's just reground and make sure we're all on board and in kind of working with the same understanding of what COHHIO Course to Home is, right? COHHIO Course to Home is what I think of as sort of a package of services or a variety of components that we are using to support schools and ESCs in Ohio around preventing and ending youth homelessness. And so what are those components? You can kind of see with our infographic here, our community of practice, which is what we're doing right now, our on-demand technical assistance, the district toolkit that we're developing, our newsletter and our listserv communications that we send out, the e-learning platform that we're developing, and we are also working to ensure that every district in Ohio has materials for students and families experiencing homelessness in the 5 most common languages spoken in Ohio. So we are working to provide you with some additional translated materials. So these are the components of COHHIO Course to Home, and today we're really leaning into that community of practice component. With that, we can go to the next, Ami, but I just really quickly, before we get into these principles, I just wanted to say hello to everyone who's saying hi in the chat from Washington Courthouse. I see Ripley Union. I see ESC of Central Ohio and Springfield. I'm seeing some Digital Academy folks. I'm seeing Muskingum, ESC. So I'm really, really, really appreciative of those of you letting us know who you are and where you're from in your rural community. Looks like folks know some of the people who are presenting today, which is awesome, and just demonstrates some of the collaboration and coordination that we know is already happening on the ground in Ohio. So great to have you all alongside us today. So we're not going to belabor these principles. They're very spelled out in our Community of Practice guidebook, but these are the principles for Community of Practice, and this is really the spirit in which we do all of our Community of Practice work. These are the principles that guide us, If you need more information about that, you can reach out to us at our email. You can also review our Community of Practice booklet. We spent a lot of time on these principles in session 1, so we're not going to spend too much time on them today, but we will check in with our agreements here quickly on the next slide. So our Community of Practice agreements, again, you can read the Guide to Community of Practice, which just kind of, if you're new to the idea of community of practice, you're trying to understand what that means and how that operates, I really cannot encourage enough that you please review our Guide to Community of Practice so you're showing up in a way that you can get the most out of this experience. Our agreements, just a couple of things I'm going to highlight. I'm not going to cover all of them today. But, you know, one of the things we always want to do when we're taking in a lot of information is check in and check out, right? There may be things that aren't quite landing, and that's okay. We just we keep moving through that. We lean into the things that are landing well, and we are listening for understanding throughout this entire process. And we're working to practice both and thinking. Again, all these agreements are really well spelled out within our Guide to Community of Practice. So if you want to dig deeper into how we got to this place, that's outlined there for you. And just one last quick point on the agreements is this is what we think of as sort of a living document. We can evolve our agreements as we grow and learn through this work. So this is not set in stone. This is something that we can adapt and build as we continue to develop our community of practice. And we can move to the next. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Nietzsche to get us grounded in our content today.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. My name is Kenya Haynes, and I am with the National Center for Homeless Education. I'm a program specialist there, and I'm based in Wyoming, where I was the state coordinator for McKinney-Vento for a number of years. And if you're unfamiliar with NCHE operates the U.S. Department of Education's Technical Assistance Center for the McKinney-Vento program. And so I did want to just point you to some of our resources, just in case you hadn't had the opportunity to visit. In particular, you have the website. All of the materials on that website have been vetted by the McKinney-Vento program at the U.S. Department of Education. So if you're looking for ways to strengthen your program, or you want to better understand the law and what the U.S. Department of Education is expecting from you as a liaison, that is a good place to visit. There is a liaison toolkit you might want to check out. And I'll also point you to our helpline. There's a phone number and an email address. If you ever have questions about your program and you need to run them by somebody, I would encourage you to reach out. Generally, you'll hear back from somebody within a business day, Monday through Friday. Next, please. And what I've been invited to do for you today is to give just a very brief opening and context setting for the rest of our discussion today. So we're not going to go terribly deep into a lot of this content, because you're going to have an opportunity to hear from some really amazing speakers and panelists as we go throughout our time together. But what I wanted to start with is just thinking about this kind of myth of urban youth homelessness. I don't know if you've had the opportunity to maybe do some community outreach and speak at a local Kiwanis club or maybe a women's league, but if you ask them to describe what homelessness looks like, what youth homelessness and family homelessness looks like, a lot of times what you hear are perhaps somebody sleeping in a park, maybe a tent city in an urban area, somebody under a bridge, perhaps thinking of large shelter systems that they might see on the news or in other different depictions in different media. But what they don't necessarily think about are perhaps the young person who is staying in a storage shed, or perhaps the family that is parked in the Walmart parking lot because you live in an area where there aren't shelters available. And so what I really wanted to talk to you about are just some of the numbers. You're going to go a little bit deeper into this with Chapin Hall, but we'll talk a little bit about some context. Next, Ami. And so the first thing I just want to point out is that rates of poverty have historically been much higher in rural areas than in urban ones. In fact, If you go back to the 1950s, the poverty rates in rural areas were double that of cities. And so we've done a really good job in closing that gap, but that discrepancy still exists. So if you look at the 2019 American Community Survey, you'll see that when you look at metro communities versus the non-metro communities, so your rural areas, the rate of poverty in rural areas still is higher in our rural communities than in our urban ones. And we also know that homelessness, it doesn't discriminate based on where you live. It affects rural areas and urban areas both. And so the data below here is just a comparison of youth ages 13 through 17 who are experiencing homelessness. And you can see that when you look at the prevalence of homelessness in rural counties versus urban counties, you're looking at very similar percentages. And while this will play out in larger numbers in your urban areas, just because there are more people, is still a resource or a support that's desperately needed in some of our rural communities, and perhaps more so just because we tend to be a little bit less resourced in our rural communities. Next. And so you're going to hear directly from Chapin Hall in a moment, but I did just want to pull out this quote from one of the briefs that they have done in their research on rural homelessness. And a lot of the research that has been done really focuses on those urban areas. And so we don't necessarily have as much data and information about what works in our rural communities. So the lack of evidence of what works in supporting young people in rural contexts limits our ability to identify effective programs or practices to serve them. And so that's one of the reasons why opportunities like this, where we have this community of practice to talk and share, are really important. Because you really need to talk to your liaisons in neighboring counties and build relationships, because you might be your best resources. Next. And so I did want to, before you got deep into your conversation, point out just a couple of things to think about as you go through your discussion time today. One is just around identification of young people and families experiencing homelessness in your communities. Sometimes living in a small town, we kind of have this bias that we know everybody, we know what's going on, and we maybe depend on some of our implicit biases in reaching out to families and identifying them for support. So one of the things to think about is really looking at your local data to help you determine if your McKinney-Vento program is doing a really good job of identifying those people in need of services. And if you're looking for kind of a touch point on where to begin as you're looking at your numbers, your identification rates, I'm going to point you to that 2.5% number. I think a lot of you may have heard kind of traditionally over the years, there's been a number, maybe 10% of students in poverty thrown around. And that is a decent benchmark, but what we point to is from our US Department of Education data. And so for all school districts, urban, rural, across the country, right now, identification rates fall at about 2.5% of the overall student population. So if you look at the number of students that are enrolled in your school system and the number of students that you have identified for McKinney-Vento, and you find that your percentage is much lower than this, then that might indicate that there's a need to do some more outreach in your community, do some more professional development, perhaps for people outside of your own individual office, because this isn't something that the McKinney-Vento liaison can do on your own. You really need the help and support of others. I know that when I was a classroom teacher, I had students who were McKinney-Vento eligible in my classroom, but I had no idea what McKinney-Vento was. And so there were missed opportunities for students to get support, and they missed it because I just didn't have that information. And not only classroom teachers, but think about other support staff in your buildings as well. I think one of the most interesting things, conversations I had working in McKinney-Vento was going to a state transportation conference, and not speaking to the transportation directors, but to bus drivers. And after giving a presentation about McKinney-Vento, I was just swarmed with stories, because these are people who are out in your communities, they're driving around, they're talking to young people, and they have a really good insight into what is happening in their homes and their families. And also, even looking at custodians. I had an instance where a young person was living in their car and the custodian became aware of it. And so he was allowing this young woman to stay in the school building while he did his evening cleanup until he had to lock up the building for the night. He would let her in early in the morning so she could take a shower before he opened up the building to other staff and students. And he didn't know that there was a person in the school system who could provide some assistance. And nobody knew about her situation until graduation, when he showed up as her family. And so that's, there are a lot of missed opportunities. So we want to make sure that we are spreading our word, spreading the training to everybody that we can possibly touch. And looking at outside of your school building, your school system itself, looking at building relationships with your community agencies, which I'm sure a lot of you are already doing, but I would encourage you to think about some non-traditional ones as well. If you're not working with your local domestic violence shelters, then that is a connection you really need to make, because families fleeing violence often fall into housing instability. And so building trusting relationships there so that you can smooth over services and referrals will be really important. And then in services, I would encourage you also to focus on student outcomes. And sometimes you'll hear this phrased as beyond the backpack. So I think one of the first things we do, especially if we're new to McKinney-Vento, is we look for really tangible things that we can do for a family. So hygiene supplies, school supplies, things of that nature. And those are very important. But what we also really want to be thinking about is helping students succeed academically, helping them get to graduation, helping them transition from K-12 either into the workforce or post-secondary, and having those connections as well. Because we know that there's a correlation between that lack of that high school credential and experiences of future homelessness. And we want to make sure that we're not only focusing on immediate needs, but thinking towards the future. And then I put a phrase here that will be familiar to some of you who have worked with YHDP, or the Youth Homelessness Demonstration Program. I know that some of you are directly involved in that. But this idea of nothing about us without us. So as you are building your policies, as you're deciding on interventions that you're going to put in place, I would encourage you to actually reach out to your families, reach out to your young people, and bring them into that decision-making process. A lot of times we think of bringing in people with lived expertise as kind of an afterthought. We build a policy, we build a program, and then we take it to them and ask for kind of a rubber stamp. But what I think is really beneficial and sometimes uncomfortable is to actually have families and young people at the table to actually build and develop those policies to help determine priorities for your spending for the funds that you have. Because oftentimes what they need might be different than what you would assume that they would need. And I think it's just really, truly important. And especially for young people, it also helps build leadership skills, it helps build autonomy, and it makes sure that your program is actually going to be effective. Next. So I did want to leave you with my contact information, and I think I also saw a question in the chat, which I'll grab real quickly. I will not be able to join you for all of the time today. I'll have to jump off early. But if you do have some questions, I encourage you to either send an email to me, or when you download the slides, there's also, again, that contact for our helpline. You can submit questions about anything related to the McKinney-Vento program, and we'll provide you with an answer for that. And I think the question was about the 2.5%. Yes. So based on the data, every year you submit data to your state Department of Education about your McKinney-Vento program, and that information is rolled up and submitted to the US Department of Education. And so based on that data that is submitted directly from schools to the US Department of Education, we know that 2.5% of the overall student population is generally what we see identified as McKinney-Vento. So if you're just looking for a starting place in looking at your data and looking at your identification rates, that's just a good benchmark to start with. The overall number of students and families experiencing homelessness may be higher, but that at least gives you kind of a ballpark to get started with.
Thank you so much for being with us today and for covering this content. We really, really, really appreciate it. I feel like this is a great sort of framing and level set as we start to take a deeper dive into some of this data and some of these concepts. So very, very, very much appreciate you being here and sharing your contact information, and hope that others in the session found this helpful. Ami, if you could take the screen down for just a second so that Chapin Hall can pull their screen up and begin to share their slides. We're going to go ahead and transition now over to Matt. So with that, Matt, I'm going to pass it off to you to say hello, and we'll keep it moving.
Great. Thanks so much, Lisa. Just give me 1 second to get all set up here. Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for having me. Thank you, Lisa, for organizing this. And Kenya, thank you for such a fantastic level setting on this work and these issues. I really appreciate that. And I'll link back to much of what Kenya shared. So first and foremost, I just want to thank you all for the critical work that you do every day. I'm a nerd. I'm a research fellow at Chapin Hall, and based in New York City, go by pronouns he, him, and I am a nerd. I like long walks on the beach and evenings of designing unbiased sampling strategies. It is kind of what I do. But I came into this through a kind of personal route. I grew up in Central Florida, and at the time had lost both my parents at a young age, grew up with a lot of household trauma, and with substance use issues and mental health issues in my household, and was runaway youth at an early age. But I was lucky because a teacher saw potential in me before I saw it myself. She noticed things were going on. She didn't ask about what was happening in my life, but realized two things. One was that probably whatever was going on was difficult, and she saw potential. And so she advocated for me to get involved in honors classes when my grades didn't warrant it. And she also happened to be involved in a local effort, youth adult partnership, to help a group of young people launch a fully youth-driven drop-in center, teen center for other young people in our community. And there was this amazing commitment from other young people who weren't student government presidents. They weren't your traditional leaders, but they were supported by a group of caring adults from the school system and from the community who believed in them and their potential. And they did everything from painting the walls to hiring and firing adult staff. So a really radical youth adult partnership model. And these young people received a grant for $1 million from a foundation to build out 5 more of these teen centers. And then I finally had gotten involved as one of the leads of this group when I was 16. And it really changed my life, and was invited to give a keynote address for the White House's first National Youth Summit when I was 17. And then that kind of launched me as an introvert overnight into youth homelessness advocacy and youth empowerment. But I share that because I also want to reinforce that I was lucky. And not everybody's so lucky, including my little sister, who still experiences homelessness to this day, went through significant trauma. Many of the young people around me who were disproportionately Black, Brown, LGBTQ young people who were less likely to be so lucky. And they not only continue to experience adversity and homelessness and housing instability, but they remained invisible, and so did their experiences. And it made me angry that we lived in a society in which we had lucky and unlucky young people. It made me angry that we had so many young people whose experiences remained invisible. And that is especially true for young people who live in rural and remote communities. And so I just want to lift you up and say thank you. I wouldn't be where I am if it weren't for work and the passion, the commitment of people like you who are in young people's lives every day, trying to do what you can, and shedding light on their experiences so that we can have better systems. So thank you for that. But that also brings us to why I got into research, and we have a national research agenda to make the visible more visible and shed light on our blind spots, and kind of speaking a lot to what Kenya had raised just recently. So part of that work has been at Chapin Hall over the last 5-6 years has been to run a national research agenda on youth homelessness. And we looked around and realized that even basic data, how many youth were experiencing homelessness, what their characteristics were, what do we know about programs and practices. When I used to be in the federal government, we were relying on data that didn't exist to make better decisions. And so when I came to Chapin Hall, my colleagues and I raised both public and private funds to launch Voices of Youth Count, a national comprehensive research agenda to fill really important knowledge gaps for our communities and for our policymakers about this population. Partnership with youth and communities. We partnered with 22 counties. One of those was Delaware County in Ohio, across the country, and the young people in those communities. So what I'm going to share are some bits of data and evidence that I hope will help arm you, give you information that you can use to start a conversation or to drive an agenda in your community around these issues. And everything that I'm going to share, all of our research, we produce in user-friendly reports and briefs and graphics, and we put them up on our website. They're all free of charge and you can access them. So please use them, look them up, make fun of them, whatever it takes, but start a conversation around data. I hope you find it helpful. But I'm going to give a little bit of an overview of what we've done. So one of the things that we did was to conduct the first national prevalence and incidence study of youth and young adult homelessness. Historically, we relied a lot on administrative data or shelter data or data on young people that were counted at a point in time. And that was always just a sort of thumbnail picture of the full extent of the challenge. So when we asked young people, we conducted a survey with a representative sample of about 25,000 people and asked young people directly about their experiences of homelessness, not just at a point in time, but over a year, recognizing that young people's experiences can be fluid. We found much higher, more broader and more hidden challenge than previously understood. 1 in 30 adolescent minors ages 13 to 17 reported some form of homelessness in a year. With young adults, the rates increased to 1 in 10, reporting some form of homelessness in a year. And about half of those were young people reporting couch surfing arrangements without a safe and stable place to stay, underscoring the extent to which these challenges can be so hidden for young people in particular and difficult to identify through traditional identification approaches that were really devised for older adults and families. And we see similar trends when we look at student homelessness in particular. So Kenya raised that when we look at administrative data reported by schools about students experiencing homelessness, you get in the range of about 2.3, 2.5% of the student population reporting homelessness in high schools, or middle school and high schools. And when we look at survey data, however, for example, these are surveys that are conducted across the country through the Youth Risk Behavior Survey. And many of those now include a module on homelessness. So this isn't about definitions because they use the same definition of homelessness that the federal government uses to report students in schools. It's simply about asking young people directly and not waiting for young people to be in a point of crisis reporting them. But when surveys are conducted asking people about their experience of homelessness, we get about double rate of homelessness, about double the identification. So again, underscoring, we have a significant distance between what we tend to identify as student homelessness and the actual level of that experience in schools. And so we've got to think more creatively. We have to build in better investments in identification and outreach. And I'll come back to some of the ways that we're working with school systems to do that. The other thing that we learned from our national research was that not all young people experience homelessness at equal rates. Some young people face far higher risk for homelessness. For example, LGBTQ plus identifying young people experience homelessness at more than twice the rate of their cisgender heterosexual peers. Not only do LGBTQ youth experience homelessness at higher rates, but among young people experiencing homelessness, LGBTQ young people tend to face higher levels of adversity and trauma both during and before their homelessness experiences. Now, this graphic on the left is based on in-depth interviews we conducted with 215 young people in 5 communities across the country who were currently experiencing homelessness. And we asked about various experiences and adversities that they had both before and during homelessness. Now, to be clear, these rates are really horrible and much too high for all young people experiencing homelessness. But what you see is that LGBTQ youth experiencing homelessness had about 3 times the rate of having reported exchanging sex for basic needs or for housing, having been forced to have sex, and about twice the rate of being harmed by self or others, about twice the rate of facing discrimination both in and outside the house. This is really important because what we heard from young people over and over again is that they weren't just going to take a service or a program because it was offered in a community. They would engage with services when they felt safe and affirmed by those services and supports. And being safe and affirming as a space and building a reputation around that has to be earned. It's not something you get with a cultural sensitivity training or a workshop. It is constantly daily practice and commitment by a school system, by an individual, by an organization to earn that reputation so that young people feel safe and affirmed. Otherwise, they will stay on the streets. They will stay in unsafe couch surfing situations rather than engage in sports and services. And that's a very logical decision when we understand the adversities that young people are coming from. The other thing that we saw is that there are significant racial and ethnic differences and disparities in youth and young adult homelessness, with Black and Brown young people facing far higher risk of homelessness. American Indian, Alaska Native young people face the highest rates of homelessness, about 3 times the rates, 3 to 4 times the rate of homelessness of white non-Hispanic peers. But they're a relatively small share of the population, so they often get much less policy attention and targeted supports. There's also an important intersectionality that I don't think, having grown up in this field of youth homelessness services and advocacy, I would say that we have not as a field grappled with very well. I'd say we'd paid attention for a long time to sexual orientation and gender identity and lines of markers of exclusion along those lines. We have not grappled with the need to center racial justice and equity and the intersectionality between different identities, including race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, and gender identity. And these data here with the graphic on the right reinforce why that is so important. So Black non-LGBTQ youth had about twice the rate of homelessness of white non-LGBTQ youth, as did white LGBTQ youth. But young people who identified as both Black and LGBTQ had 4 times rate of homelessness as youth who identified as white, cisgender, heterosexual. And for young people who identified as trans and as a racial or ethnic minority, these rates were even higher in their experiences of adversity, which were very high. So we need to think intersectionally about the policies and the services and supports that are safing and affirming and meeting young people's needs, and particularly in communities of color for these supports and services. The other thing that came very clearly through the data was the extent to which we need to think intersectionally across systems. No one system is going to end youth homelessness on its own. And it's very limiting when we simply think about young people in siloed spaces or sectors. And these data demonstrate why. So when we conducted surveys with young people across 22 counties on a given night when they were experiencing homelessness, we asked them about their experiences with other public systems. Nearly half of youth experiencing homelessness at a given time had ever been in juvenile detention, prison, or jail. 46%. 29%, or almost a third of young people experiencing homelessness had ever been in foster care, which is pretty astounding when you consider that only 2% of the general youth population has ever been in foster care. And then Kenya alluded to this, 1/3 of young adults experiencing homelessness lacked a high school diploma or GED. In fact, when we looked at the correlates related to a young person experiencing homelessness, the single factor that had the strongest correlation with young adult homelessness was the lack of a high school diploma or GED. Those young people were 4.5 times more likely to experience homelessness than young people who had a high school diploma. 4.5 times. It doesn't mean dropping out of school causes homelessness. What it means is that school disengagement and homelessness share common underlying risk and protective factors. And if we care about an educational justice mission, educational equity, we have to center homelessness as well as part of that mission. And so that's why your work is just so critically important. And then more and more as states are starting to collect data, for example, Washington State, we're starting to learn more and more about the importance of behavioral health as well, a system that we've historically not paid as much attention to. But in Washington State, they collected data on exits from different public systems into homelessness over 1 year. The largest number of young people exiting a system into homelessness came from inpatient behavioral health systems, even more so than the juvenile justice or foster care systems. I want to underscore the importance of the intersections of education and homelessness prevention. So, like I said, single greatest correlate for homelessness of the variables we measured was the lack of a high school diploma or GED. And at the same time, young adults experiencing homelessness were 1/3 as likely as stably housed young people to be enrolled in a 4-year college. We also know that among youth experiencing homelessness, youth of color, particularly Black and Brown identifying young people, are less likely to have at least some college education, which makes it harder for them to get on a path to self-sufficiency and independence, even as these programs are providing support. So there really has to be a stronger intentionality of schools working with community-based organizations on preventing both homelessness and school dropout together. And on the other end, there needs to be a very strong level of collaboration and coordination around helping young people who are experiencing homelessness not only get stably housed, but also have pathways to education and career development for long-term stability. Now to rural issues. Kenya raised this really articulately as well. There is this kind of myth or this assumption that homelessness, including youth homelessness, is an inner city issue. It's an East Coast, West Coast issue. And that is simply not what we found. Because we conducted a nationally representative survey, we had the ability to look at commonalities and differences across all different types of geographies. And what we found was that the rates of youth homelessness were statistically equal between rural and non-rural communities. Now, it doesn't mean the number of youth who are experiencing homelessness were the same, because there are more youth experiencing homelessness in urban communities because there are more human beings in urban communities. But as a share of the population, this is truly a national challenge and just as prevalent in rural communities. In addition, what we found was that while prevalence rates were similar between rural and non-rural communities, homelessness looked different in rural communities. In rural communities, youth experiencing homelessness were about half as likely to be staying in shelters, which makes sense because the shelters are often non-existent, or they're not youth friendly, or they take an hour or 2 hours to drive to. They're about twice as likely to be staying with others, couch surfing, or doubling up in rural communities compared to larger, more urban communities. So again, more of an invisible issue in rural communities that requires much more creative cross-systems identification. This is really important because when you look at HUD's data on the number of people experiencing homelessness, about half of the people that are counted as experiencing homelessness are counted as sheltered homeless. But if you don't have shelters, or if young people aren't showing up in shelters, then that means that they're much, excuse me, much less likely to be counted and identified. And then we start to assume that it's not a rural issue, that there's not as much youth homelessness in these rural communities, whereas the issue is that they're just not showing up in systems that tend to count literally half of people that are experiencing homelessness. Sorry, just getting over a cold, so I might grab a cough drop. The other thing that we saw was that rural youth experiencing homelessness are more likely to be out of school and out of work compared to youth in larger, more urban communities. So you see that here with about a little bit more than a 10 percentage point difference in young people who are not attending school or who are involved in employment. This presents additional barriers for young people in rural communities to exit homelessness and get on stable paths to housing stability and thriving. And it reinforces the need for services and supports that are youth-friendly, youth-oriented, and help young people make connections, not just to housing, but to long-term resources for stable. So what I'll speak to now is a little bit more of the rural-specific work that we did as follow-up. This was in partnership with the National Network for Youth and who had funding from the Oak Foundation. And Chapin Hall was asked to come in, building on our work that we've done with Voices of Youth Count, and engage in more qualitative research with people like yourselves, with McKinney-Vento liaisons, and rural communities with service providers, with communities, with policymakers in local and state jurisdictions that had a special focus on rural youth homelessness issues, and with young people with lived experience in homelessness in rural communities. And we conducted 7 focus groups with 45 individuals and a review of the literature and various consultations to gather a deeper level of insight on potential challenges and solutions with young people. Few issues that are 2 things that came through quite clearly. First was what I've just underscored with some of the data that we've shown, which is that there's a perennial challenge of undercounting of youth experiencing homelessness, which is true throughout the country, including in urban communities, but was more pronounced in rural communities for the reasons that we've mentioned. And many young people in rural communities just not aware of basic services or supports that they were eligible for or entitled to, and including a lack of knowledge of the presence of school liaisons for supporting students experiencing homelessness. There were key resource gaps across all issues in public systems, lack of housing navigation, lack of behavioral health services for young people, lack of transportation and technology, which came through as particularly prominent, important in rural communities, and a lack of safe spaces for young people to show up, get help, get support, and find cohesion with other young people with shared experiences. We tend to think of rural youth homelessness as a white issue that sort of made it into the policy narrative when it's talked about, and it is rural, poor white, and low-income white youth homelessness is a significant challenge, but at the same time, disparities are just as common in rural communities and youth homelessness as elsewhere, and in particular, Black and Brown identifying young people, American Indian, Alaska Native, young people facing very high rates of homelessness in these communities as well, and reporting racism through public systems that contribute to their homelessness and make it harder for them to exit. And tribal nations and marginalized communities, really identifying lack of funding to develop coherent strategies to support their needs. And LGBTQ plus young people reinforcing the lack of affirming services and supports for that, again, could both disrupt their pathways in homelessness and support their pathways out of it. And this gets back to some of the data I've shared before. When your experiences involve so much discrimination and adversity, it makes it even less likely for you to engage services going forward. So this is an area that we have to address with a lot of intentionality. The importance of cross-system collaboration came through over and over again, especially in rural communities where often there's not a runaway homeless youth specific service provider. And if there is, It might not be covering the full range of remote areas around a rural jurisdiction or have the full capacity. The work across public systems and thinking more broadly about who's responsible for engaging and supporting young people experiencing homelessness, we have to think broader about that. We have to think about formal institutions like public schools, juvenile courts, behavioral health systems, but we also have to think about informal institutions like nonprofits, Big Brothers, Big Sisters, Boys and Girls Clubs, faith-based community organizations, YMCAs, any organization that can be connected to young people needs to be able to be in a position to understand and youth homelessness, to be able to play a role in identification and connecting with young people with adequate supports and services. But barriers to youth collaboration were significant. So the last 6-7 years, we've seen a greater resurgence around youth-adult partnerships and elevating youth with lived expertise and making sure they're involved in shared decision-making. HUD now requires that as part of its youth homelessness demonstration project funding, so we're seeing more and more attention to that. But there are unique barriers to youth partnership in geographic areas because people are more dispersed. So young people with lived experience constantly or consistently identified issues like technological challenges, tokenization, because they weren't always as meaningfully as involved. So they were invited to come to the table or share a story, but not really to bring their expertise and to contribute to different systems and services. A lot of exclusion of marginalized youth, youth of color, LGBTQ identifying young people, having a harder time finding a meaningful seat at the table, and the lack of funding to support their meaningful participation and pay them and compensate them for their time and their expertise in an adequate way. So roles of schools came up really consistent as a key actor. Schools are the common denominator in rural communities. We're the touch point for so many young people. And so there is no single institution that is better positioned to identify youth experiencing homelessness and connect them with support. There is no institution that's better positioned to help prevent young people's pathways into homelessness, obviously in partnership with others, but as a sort of connecting institution, schools came up as playing a really important role there, not by themselves, but particularly in identifying youth and raising awareness, playing roles in dismantling systemic racism, and supporting LGBTQ plus, affirming the services and supports to young people in the community. There's another sort of related body of work I just want to elevate for you that I think might be especially relevant in rural communities. We've started in moving from this sort of better understanding of the problem of youth homelessness. We've been moving more into the solution space in partnership with specific jurisdictions. We started in some cases with more urban areas, like right now in New York, San Francisco, and Oakland, but now moving into rural communities on the solutions as well, like New Hampshire, rural areas in Minnesota, and Illinois. And what we're hearing from these communities is, from young people in particular, is the need for much more flexible empowerment-based solutions. Recognizing youth homelessness is not a boutique issue. We're not going to solve it with shelters and transitional living programs alone. They can play important roles in crisis response, but we need to recognize this as a public health challenge that requires scalable solutions that can affect youth homelessness at the population level. So that brought young people to thinking more about interventions like direct cash transfers with optional supportive services, which has a very robust international evidence base, but has never been systematically designed or evaluated for addressing youth homelessness, and might have particular promise in rural communities because brick and mortar interventions can be very limiting in rural communities where a young person has to drive an hour or two or has to leave their community to seek services. But if services could be provided in the form of direct cash transfers that allow young people more choice in identifying housing solutions, like staying with family if they can contribute to utilities, or getting into a shared apartment living arrangement, finding an apartment in their own community with the financial assistance to do so, coupled with virtual supports and services like peer navigation, housing navigation and financial coaching that can follow them wherever they go. It gives young people much more freedom and flexibility to exit homelessness quickly and to get on paths to thriving according to their own goals and priorities. And so New York City launched the first direct cash transfer with supported service model specifically around addressing youth homelessness just over the last few months. We've been leading this with our partners, Point Source Youth and organizations here, and we're implementing a rigorous evaluation, and now HUD's considering funding direct cash transfers through a model like this that's built around housing. So it's a really exciting time. And we have multiple jurisdictions that are considering adapting this model and the evaluation around it to their own communities. And states like New Hampshire are finding that this can be especially helpful in rural communities because it just empowers young people so much more around flexibility and choice. In New York City, this is the model that's being kind of adapted. We call it Cash Plus because it involves cash to address financial constraints to exiting homelessness and non-cash services like peer navigation and housing navigation, financial coaching to address non-financial constraints to exiting homelessness, recognizing youth need both. Young people co-designed this every step of the way. We made changes to it based on young people's input. So it involves about $30,000 over 2 years, roughly $1,100 a month, which is about what it takes a young person to afford an apartment share in the outer borough of New York City, with a one-time $3,000 payment to say pay first or last month's rent, or support exits from homelessness, or address the housing crisis as it comes up. It's all delivered through a non-profit platform called Up Together that allows each youth to choose the payment mechanism that works best for them, whether it's Venmo or direct deposit to a bank. If they are undocumented or lack a bank account, they can also get a prepaid card. So it's really nice and flexible. And it means every local nonprofit doesn't have to reinvent the wheel to make payments. This is an infrastructure that will work anywhere in the country. And we're working with Up Together and young people to customize it around the needs of young people experiencing homelessness. And then there are virtual and non-virtual support services, again, co-determined by young people to help support young people with their broader well-being and needs beyond financial assistance. The other thing that we're doing that I want to highlight for you is moving more upstream. We can't end youth homelessness without prevention. Historically, this has kind of been the approach to homelessness in our country. This has been our policy approach. And if I were in the room with you today, I'd be asking you, how many of you have heard the term triage used in your work? And usually what I get from the McKinney-Vento liaisons is almost every hand is constantly in a state of triage. Triage was popularized in World War I. This is a picture when the French term that was used because they had too many bloody bodies strewn over a battlefield, and you can only apply medical attention to so many people at once. So you look for the people that were most likely to die immediately and applied medical assistance to them. It never meant that the other people didn't need help, and it was never designed as a day-to-day way to serve people. It's never designed. We were never designed to be at war and have bloody bodies strewn all over a battlefield every day for 40 years. That's what we've seen though with homelessness, is that we have been at war with homelessness every single day. And we have not devised policy strategies or put public investment into preventing young people from experiencing the crisis, the trauma of homelessness in the first place. And so we have forced ourselves into a constant state of triage. And this is something that we're trying to flip on its head. We're trying to show that we can walk and chew gum at the same time. Yes, if you have limited resources, you have to triage the young people who need it most at once, but we should also be challenging the fact that we have a constant state of housing crisis to begin with, which is totally unnecessary in the world's richest country. So that requires a more comprehensive approach to preventing and ending youth homelessness. And this is where we move beyond a crisis response system. We do need to improve the crisis response system around youth. And so that's a big part of it. But we're not going to end youth homelessness until we make it rare and one time as well. That requires prevention across public systems and work once young people exit homelessness to ensure their long-term stability on the back end. And these are the places, when you look at that prevention sliver of the pie and stable housing sliver of the pie, where it's no longer the homelessness system or the continuum of care, that's the star actor. It really has to be other public systems that play the leading role in prevention and long-term stabilization and support. So that's why your work in the systems in which you work is so critical to the goal of ending youth homelessness. So I won't go through this a lot, but just to say what we're trying to do is use our research, our data, and the views of young people lived experience to take a more public health approach to homelessness, which we have not done historically. Just like we would not, whether it was diabetes or HIV/AIDS or COVID-19 for that matter, we would not try to solve these issues with just an emergency room approach. Think about it. What if we tried to solve COVID-19 only with the hospital treatment beds? Or what if we never brought prevention into diabetes or HIV/AIDS? We would constantly be at war with these issues. And yet that's what we've done with homelessness. We've created an emergency room as the whole of the healthcare system. We've treated a crisis response system as the whole of the homelessness policy framework. And so that's what we're trying to change and move more upstream and recognize the role of different actors. And what a public health framework teaches us from all of these other examples is that the more upstream we go, the more we work to address not just homelessness or the crisis of it and response to it, but proactively identifying the causes and the pathways into homelessness and addressing those pathways earlier, the bigger a population level impact we can have. The more that we wait for young people to come into trauma and adversity of homelessness and to go through homelessness, the more individual level effort, resources, and treatment that's required. And in fact, we know from good data now that the single greatest pathway into older adult homelessness is not substance use, it's not domestic violence, it's not eviction, it's youth homelessness, child homelessness. It's the single most common pathway. And so if we care about the crisis of homelessness overall, want to address that homelessness seriously at the population level, we have to start earlier, we have to start upstream. So we want to show what's possible. There is this narrative that homelessness, I think, is always going to be with us. It's a fact of life. We walk by somebody in the streets or behind a Walmart to say, well, that's the way it is. And we've adopted that as the fact of life that it is not, and it should not be. In my own lived experience, I know what can happen when people move more upstream and engage us earlier. And there is so much that is indeed possible. So I want to share one example of that. So Eliud Kipchoge, for example, broke the 2-hour marathon a few years ago. People said it would be physically impossible to do that, like their heart would explode, but he did it. So let's look at what, as an avid runner, I find this, sort of really exciting, and there's a lot of potential in it. And what I want to say is that when we look at Eliud Kipchoge's experience, how did Eliud Kipchoge run under a 2-hour marathon? And what were the active ingredients of that? First, he had friends. He had 42 top athletes from around the world that trained with him and would run different intervals or rotations of 6 miles over the course of the 26-mile marathon with Eliud and help keep him on pace. And if anybody interviewed Eliud after his accomplishment, he would say, this was not an individual achievement, which everybody assumes with running. This was a group achievement that he attributed to others. The other thing that people paid a lot of attention to was cool shoes. He had the Nike Vaporfly Next. They had carbon fiber plates. They had a little bounce. They were light. They were constructed a little bit differently. Anybody wants to know what to get me for my birthday, this would be great. And a lot of attention was around the cool shoes, and they gave a little bit up. He also had Patrick Sang, his coach. And Patrick saw, as a fellow Kenyan, his role not just as addressing Eliud Kipchoge's running needs, but also his life needs that presented barriers to him being the full and successful person that he could be, as well as the full and successful runner that he could be. So he had somebody, he had my high school English teacher, and he had somebody who was crazy about him and helped him meet his needs. Then they had data, literally laser beams that shot down from an electric car that didn't emit fuel and helped them maintain a 4-minute, 32-second mile, 26 miles in a row. Kind of crazy, right? But they needed to be able to maintain that pace and know when they were off that pace and readjust quickly. Constantly collecting and paying attention to data. It might not be in the form of laser beams, but it can be very powerful, not only to make sure that we are disrupting pathways into homelessness and meeting the outcomes we want, but also to be able to calibrate around equity, making sure that our outcomes are equitable along different identities and axes of exclusion. And then finally, there was the hard work that didn't get as much attention. This is not, people paid attention to the shoes and the laser beams. Nobody really paid attention to the 140 miles of training in the Ethiopian highlands that Iliad and his colleagues had to run for months to get training at high altitude and do the hard work. So I elevate this because there's an example of this that we're working with school systems in the US to implement right now. This comes from a model in Australia. It's called the Geelong Project, named after the first town that it started in. And it involves schools working with community-based organizations, not to just respond to the crisis of student homelessness, but to prevent it from happening in the first place. And in Australia, early results showed a 40% reduction in student homelessness and a 20% reduction in school dropout. Again, getting back to the intersectionality of these issues in high school. And they later called the upstream model. We and the Canadians have partnered with the Australians to pilot and adapt this model in the United States to show what's possible, to show that we can move upstream. And that involves schools having these common elements that hopefully now will feel familiar after we sort of paid a little attention to Eliud Kipchoge's experience. It involves schools and community collaboration. Working together. So schools recognizing they can't do it alone, community-based organizations recognizing they can't do it alone. Schools are the best place to identify student experiences and risk factors early before the point of crisis, but they need connection to supports in the community to disrupt pathways into homelessness. It involves a cool tool, call it this student strengths and needs survey. It's a universal screening survey that unless a student's parents opt them out, a student declines, a student will participate in a 15-20 minute brief survey on risk factors for future homelessness and school dropout. It also screens for current homelessness, but what's powerful about it is it allows us to capture risk factors for homelessness before that homelessness occurs as well. And then those students are connected with their Patrick Sayers. It might be a school counselor, a liaison, and then if needed, a community-based organization that's partnered with the school to deliver youth and family-centered supports and services to disrupt pathways into homelessness. And then we're collecting good data. Every year, we're using the data from the screening survey. Every year, we're looking at equity patterns, and making sure that we're achieving the outcomes that we want and calibrating services and systems as needed in partnership with young people. And then all of this is meant to be constantly centered around accountability and action that centers racial justice and equity. This should be familiar to some extent because it's very much adapting an existing model that's very common in school systems across the country. It's more or less a multi-tiered system of support, but adapted around homelessness prevention, which means that we're building in systems to identify student needs and their families' needs, and then integrating different levels of action and resource depending on what the student and or their family needs to disrupt pathways into homelessness and disrupt pathways into school dropout. So just hopefully this is helpful. I just wanted to share some of the background data that you can use in your communities to have a conversation, some of the solutions that we're working on in partnership with jurisdictions and school systems. And I want to thank you. We really cannot end youth homelessness without you and the role that you play and your colleagues in the communities. So thank you for everything that you do to make the invisible visible and make sure there's no such thing as an unlucky young person.
Thank you so much. Wow, that was a really, really, really powerful message from beginning to end. Matthew, we really, really appreciate it. Lots of discussion in the chat. People are really excited about the direct cash transfer pilot happening. People are kind of stewing over how could we do something like that locally? What would that look like? How do we get the feds on the education side as excited as HUD seems to be? Usually it's the other way around, so that's kind of interesting. And how can we continue to build that? And so really appreciate this information. What we're going to do now is kind of shift to our panel, who's going to start reflecting a little bit on what they heard from Nietzsche and Chapin Hall as it relates to the work that they do locally. We're only going to be in here until 2:30 because we're taking quite a bit of time out of folks' day towards the end of this school year as it is. So we're appreciative of your time. One of the first things I want to kind of do in terms of our panel, we have lots of folks here from the local field. Ami, if you could pull our slides back up that show our panel questions, that would be really helpful. And one of the things I want to do now, if it's okay, panelists, I know we've covered a lot of information, so like one of those small deep breaths, right? So we can keep moving, but also not be super overwhelmed by everything that we just heard. If we could, what I'm going to do is call on one of you to give me just some immediate sort of reactions to some of the information that you just heard as it relates to the work that you do at the local level. And one of the things I want to do is community of practice is all about peer sharing, right? And so it's tough to do that sometimes in the virtual world. I've been really hungry to be out and working with folks in person again, been getting to do that a little bit more here lately. But what I want to do that's a little different to make sure everyone kind of knows who everyone is just take a quick second and look at the slide here. And you can see that some of the folks from the local level that we have joining us to share some reflections, these are your peers, right? These are McKinney-Vento liaisons from rural communities. These are homeless shelter providers. These are homelessness and housing providers. And we also have an Ohio student with us today to share some reflections around work that's going on in rural communities around youth homelessness. So we're not going to belabor introductions because you can kind of see who folks are. I have a whole set of slides of everyone's contact information so you can reach out to panelists after the fact and have discussion if you'd like. But what I want to kind of do now in these last couple of minutes here, Amy Eldridge, I'm thinking I'm going to start with you if that's okay. I would love to hear a few of your initial takeaways from the Nietzsche and Chapin Hall sort of overview that we heard today, and how you feel any of that's intersecting with work that you're doing, things that you're doing at the local level with schools, any just kind of immediate takeaways. And then what I'll do is if you want to invite Randall, who's here with you, to kind of chime in on anything you've already added, you can kind of invite him. And then Randall, if you want to, you can share. If not, you can pass it to Amy Vanderhoff, our other Amy, and we'll just kind of start going that way, and I'll guide you guys as we go through this discussion. But we'll start with Amy Eldridge, and then we'll go to you, Randall, if you have anything you want to add, and then we'll go to Amy Vanderhoff, and then we'll circle back and I'll keep us moving. So Amy, would love to hear any kind of initial takeaways, thoughts, reactions. And just real quick, as you're ruminating for just a second, panelists, everyone who's in here with us along the way in this session, this question is just as much for our panelists as it is for you. If you have reflections about what you've just heard, thoughts as it resonates to what you're doing at the local level, I would absolutely invite you to put that in the chat as well, so we can keep this discussion going. So with that, Amy, hopefully that gave you a little bit of time for that little breath and some time to gather your thoughts to share with us a little bit about some of your key takeaways.
Yeah, I think one of the most immediate things that's a takeaway that just reinforces, I think, our experience is that the central role of relationships with young people, and developing those relationships and teams of coordinated supports as well that are youth-centered, right? So making sure it's not everybody else deciding what the young person needs, which I've heard that, is making sure that the communication and the listening is there. I think in terms of what we do with our program, we do a lot of collaboration and have some really strong relationships with some homeless liaisons in a couple of high schools. And, that does address a lot of, if we can come in together and work with a young person, and we can support, and together coordinate our resources and our networks. Sometimes it's someone at the high school that knows of an apartment or a landlord, or link someone to a job. Sometimes it might be us that has that. So that kind of relationship building and discussion among providers and building and developing those relationships are key. And I also think about the prevention piece too, which we are not so officially part of, but I can think of getting a call and a family about to become homeless, and the young person, the high school senior, is 18. They're going to literally become homeless, but we were able to bring them around and look at their application for rent assistance and avoid the entire family becoming homeless. And that, that was a much better outcome than anything else that could have happened.
Absolutely. Real quick, Randall, before you jump in, and you can comment on this if you have an immediate thought. One of the things Amy just immediately brought up for me, talking about these building these relationships. I know your program is relatively new, funded through a relatively new funding source. I'm curious if you have any sort of pro tips for folks on the call today who are trying to build some of those relationships, any of the mechanisms that you use to do that, anything that you would suggest to others to help build those relationships. Amy or Randall, I think that would be a great little addition to your kind of reflection there.
Yes, absolutely. In fact, I was thinking along those lines actually, because I do know, I think every county does have a housing coalition. Some may be more active than others. I do know that here in Fairfield County, our housing coalition, who meets monthly with all of the folks involved in housing, with all the spectrum and everything involved, is just a great resource. And in fact, that's where we've gotten a lot of referrals, and we've built relationships immediately here in Fairfield. Now, of course, we serve 6 counties with this program, but it's the Housing Coalition has been very good. So I would suggest to folks that if you find out if you have a housing coalition in your county and become involved, and you will learn about a lot of resources and connections when working with youth on who to refer people if you don't already know. So that's something that really kind of struck out to me. And then, of course, using our resource guide that we use for our Region 9, that helps us to know who to reach out to and who to make contacts to. So it's been critical. Building those partnerships and relationships and referrals are what drives our program. We don't get, that's where we get, find out about the youth that need our services. Are from those partnerships and relationships that we built. One quick thing I'd like to add really too is that I do like numbers and graphs, and I appreciate Matthew pointing out all of those great graphs of comparison of urban, rural, racial, LGBTQ, all of that, and to see visually, how the numbers break down. And while there are differences, there's similarities between urban and rural than there are vast differences in the need.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well said. Appreciate that. Amy Vanderhoff, I'm going to come to you to hear any kind of initial takeaways and thoughts. And then Sandra, I'm going to circle down to you for any key takeaways and thoughts. And then Heath, and then Kenny. I'm going to kind of close it out with you sharing a little bit with us about your journey towards graduation here in a couple days, and how things are going with your housing and some of the work that you've been doing with folks on the panel today. So that's going to be the flow to sort of round us out. We'll go Amy Vanderhoff, Sandra, Heath, and then Kenny. And then I have just a couple closing reminders, and that should get us right around to 2:30, I think. So with that, Amy Vanderhoff, please share with us how things are going in Marion and what some of your key takeaways are today.
My head's spinning a little bit. This is a lot of stuff. And I've actually heard Matthew speak before. So this is bringing, I like hearing it again, because you always hear more. So we are working on the Housing Coalition. We're building our housing stock and those kinds of things. But you're absolutely right. Being more visible in the high school is really, really important. And that fact that you brought up about youth homelessness is a pathway is huge to me. Dealing, and I don't know if anyone else has this issue of students experiencing homelessness often cause some issues at school, and the tendency is to want to suspend them, and that disengages them, and then here we go. So I think I've got some great facts that I can go to fight for those kids and advocate for them to keep them engaged, so that we can kind of keep that pathway. That's my most immediate takeaway right now.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that. And Sandra, I'm gonna pass it over to you for key takeaways. And in the meantime, Amy or anyone else on the panel, Rachel's got a great question in the chat about transportation. So maybe just take a quick look at that. If anybody on the panel has thoughts about that, chime in the chat. In the meantime, Sandra, take it away.
Okay, thank you. I'm Sandra Plants, local liaison here in Gallia County Local Schools. Some of the takeaways that I gathered, which is much like some of the other ones, but to hit on a couple other points, I loved how the National Center addressed with Kenya, how she addressed bus drivers, that was one of the people that sometimes we overlook, our support staff, and how valuable they are in helping us to identify youth homelessness. I know for me, my bus drivers are my best referrals from staff. They are my eyes on my children. If things change in their doubled up situation, or if they've moved and are no longer there, they see it long before anybody else will see it. So if bus drivers are trained very well in McKinney-Vento, they are one of your best identifiers. I love the beyond the backpack idea. Again, we like to address what we see is the thing. I agree with the other panelists that we have to be very good at building relationships within our community and our other service providers, because they can help us address those things beyond the backpack. Yes, we have to take care of their basic and essential and emergency needs, but we have to work with those other local providers. I also like the statistic that high school students reported more homelessness on the survey than the schools report. I know myself, I'm way above the national average. Right now, I have 8.4% of my population that is identified homeless. So I feel like I'm doing a really good job. However, I know too that there's probably twice as many kids in my high school that I'm just unaware of. And that makes me, kind of like Amy had said, to be very visible. I figure if I'm more visible, make myself more available and more awareness out in the community, especially within the school and in that high school, then I can reach and meet their needs even better. I love some of these ideas, and I've got a lot of takeaways too. We do have to partner and understand that kids are, as Matt said, they have multiple points. A lot of my kids have been incarcerated. A lot of them have been in and out of foster care. A lot of them are potential dropouts, and getting very creative about what we can do to make sure that they're not dropouts and to secure education, technical things, and get very creative. And we've done that here recently with one of my graduates, getting very, very creative, working with a technical career center to get him into some adult ed programs because he wasn't going to be successful with career tech. I mean, graduation and a diploma, and maybe getting him on the GED platform. But you've got to get creative. You've got to work with your community providers and build those relationships. I like the other point where it said they needed to feel safe. So you have to earn and build that reputation and that relationship with people, especially in rural communities. one things about rural communities is it is a sense of community. They take care of their own, and that's a very cultural aspect of rural areas. So building those relationships is key.
Absolutely, Sandra. And even just the way you speak makes me feel safe and supported. And I'm just so appreciative for you to be here today. It's been an honor working with you for years at the local level, and to just, I don't know, it's making me emotional to have you here at the state level, repping all the work in Guyatt County. I just really appreciate it. With that, Kenny, I would love to kick it over to you quickly. You've shared so much with me over the past couple of days about everything that you've been doing to work towards graduation. So I would love for you to walk us through a little bit of the work that you've done this year to achieve some of your goals and some of the people that have supported you along the way. So Kenny, if you're still with us and you're able to unmute and share a little bit about that journey, I would super appreciate it.
All right. There wasn't much that I have done aside from just saving as usual. Of course, there's a lot of me working overtime and using up most of my weekend out of it all. But most of it was working a lot of overtime at where I work at, which I'll admit that the pay is never really that great with it, but it's just a lot of overtime that I had to do because of where I work at. But keeping up with the whole rent thing has really been rough, especially with the whole epidemic going on and house prices going up. It's been rougher to keep up on rent every day, which is why I had to reach out to different jobs to find a better way to go about it. There's been a couple of times where I've almost had a panic attack because I was afraid that, I wasn't going to make it on time, but I'm glad I got my landlord with me because he's been, willing to, keep it going for a few days. He'll charge me an extra $25 for being late, but he's always been understanding and always giving me that extra time to branch out to get more money so that way I could pay the rent on time. But he's just been a big, huge help with rent. You guys have also been there too to help me out, whether it's, giving me advice on what to do or on how to go about it. And with graduation, it's been a bit also a little more difficult because, I got to wake up at 7 every day to get to school, and it's been rougher by the day because it's harder for me to get to school, especially with me having to work a little bit extra time at work and school. So it's been more difficult every day.
Kenny, thank you so much for sharing. And I would love if you could, one of the things that really stuck with me from our conversations over the past couple of weeks is the way you've talked about how the school has shown up for you as you've transitioned from staying with your neighbors, staying with your friends, to moving into your own place. Do you want to share a little bit about moving into your own place and how the school was kind of lending a listening ear through that process so others can kind of learn how they could approach that from their school? Do you want to share a little bit about that before we wrap up?
Sure. I guess it just started out when I was kicked out of my actual original house at first because of, personal matters and a little bit argumentative. But, my neighbors had told me out there because, it took me a couple of days to find someone to help me out, which then they helped me out. And, I was drawn into the office one day because, they wanted to talk to me about the whole situation, which I didn't know who had contact, who told them that was almost because I really don't like talking about the stuff because I normally keep it to myself normally because sometimes I see things as my fault. So I like to try to keep it to myself and help my own self out. School helped me out. They found it, this youth program in which they, help me budget everything and find other landlords that are able to, work with students such as myself into getting a place and saving up and just making payments every day. But my neighbors never agreed with, my lifestyle before, and they wanted me to do a full 360 on my life, and I didn't exactly agree with it. So then they kicked me out, and so I had to find a new place, and that's when my best friend had, scooped me up and told me that I could live with them. And I was sleeping in their living room for a bit, but I didn't mind that. I had everything, confined up in my bags, and I made sure that I paid them a little bit just because I felt bad that, I was already sleeping on their couch a lot. So I made sure at least to make up for it. And anytime I had a chance to fill up the fridge for them, I took that chance because I found it more sensible to give them something in return for helping me stay off the streets so I could keep up work and save up money for every day. And then that's when I was able to find my own place. I made sure I moved out immediately. That way they could have their couch back and they didn't need to worry any much longer. But ever since the apartment, nothing's really been able to save up money for anything else new, anything like that.
Absolutely. And I know that this is really kind of just the beginning in a lot of ways of living on your own, but we really, really appreciate you just sharing a little bit about how you've taken those steps, how folks have kind of popped up along the way, the work that you've done. Really, I mean, you've championed your own journey. And I know that we're appreciative to hear about it, and we're cheering you on towards graduation in the next couple of days. I think you said, what day is it that you're walking? Is that Saturday?
I think so.
Yeah, that's really exciting. And the other cool and exciting thing Kenny's shared with me is he's always out there job hunting for that next best job to overcome some of those financial barriers, and is really, I've been kind of checking in with him pretty regularly to see if he's getting this call back from a new job that has a much higher pay rate than what he's kind of having to deal with now. And so one of the things that I think I really wanted to lift up, Kenny, if it's okay, is that, sometimes us older adults have reservations about young people being able to live independently. And I think that one of the things that Kenny's story really illustrates is his desires and his wants, and what he identified as what he wanted is what the folks who were there to support him worked towards, not necessarily what they would have identified as the best thing for him, right? If he said he wanted his own place, then folks worked with him to try to make that happen. If he said, I want to go to school and I want to work, right? Then the people at the school and the folks in the provider community were working to try and make that happen. And so Kenny's ability to vocalize what he needs, not everybody has that ability, but Kenny's ability to do that, I think, has made him lucky when we think about the journey that Matt shared in the beginning of this, right? And so I think we need to consider that as we approach young people's needs, that everyone's ways of communicating what they need is different. But at the end of the day, Kenny's going to walk in a couple of days. Kenny's going to keep working hard to try and get the job that meets some of his financial needs, and continues to work with his service providers and his school on all of his goals. And so the other thing I'll just mention, Kenny's stressed about finances and bringing that up as a challenge. And I think that being able to support young people to elevate their voice and compensate them for their time is just another way that we can try to put a small drop in the bucket to support young people along their journey of achieving their goals. And so when we can ensure that young people have a platform to speak, compensate them for their time, elevate their stories as they feel like sharing them, then I think we're moving the needle a little bit on these efforts. So I want to thank all of you for being here today. I know we've gone over time just a little bit. Ami, if you could go to the slide that shows our next session so folks know what date to have on their calendar, I will close with that. Folks, we are just beginning these conversations of community of practice, right? We've thrown a lot of information at you over the last couple of months, and we are going to be digging into these things much, much deeper. So our next session will be after summer break. We will come back in the fall on September 18th to really focus in on English learners and newcomers and unaccompanied youth. And we'll circle back to this discussion around rural homelessness and other things that we've discussed in the last couple of months. So we hope to see you on September 14th. We are wishing everybody good things as they work towards graduation and wrapping up the year to get towards summer and start to establish some of their summer goals. And we thank you all so much for being here. Please check out our website where you can find a lot more information about COHHIO Course to Home, and have a great rest of the afternoon. Thank you all so much.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, you guys. Really
Nice
appreciate
job,
you.
Kenny.
Do you want me to
Kenny,
stay
if you-
after or?
Yeah, Kenny, just stay on for a second. Ami, I'm